In a moment, I'll be giving you an overview of what we're going to cover in the session today. One of the key things to flag throughout this session is your safety. Suicide and self-harm can be a trigger for some, and some viewers may find the content emotional or distressing. So please, if that is the case, please pause the session and find some help and support. There will be information below this recording where you can access support. I'll also be providing some information at the end of the session too. So what we're going to talk about today is we'll do a bit of reflection to summarise what you might have learned if you've been on the mental health first aid training. We'll look at suicide and self-harm in terms of some of the risks, effects and what we're doing around prevention, specifically what government initiatives are in place. We'll talk about the links to alcohol and substance misuse, social media, prisons, and then, as I've mentioned there at the very end, we'll touch on self-care, what you might do for your own self-care, as well as sources of information and support. So just to begin then, and to reflect on what key things you might be able to recall from your mental health first aid training in regards to suicide and self-harm. And for each of these areas, we're going to think a little bit around some of the facts and language, the intent, and how we might support someone. Some of the key facts and myths around suicide to begin with were dispelled as part of your mental health first aid training. This includes some of the key ones that all suicide attempts, in all cases, someone may say, do, or behave in a way that might indicate thoughts of suicide or an intent. In all circumstances where suicide intent is revealed must be taken seriously at all times, and asking directly about suicide is not going to give someone a thought that they've never had. We also do not use the word commit anymore. Now, when I say anymore, the law changed 50 years ago. The word commit implies it's a crime. The word that we would use in terms of the correct language around suicide would be completed or died by suicide. Asking directly will indicate that you care, you're listening to them, taking them seriously. So do not dismiss it as attention seeking. We talked about on the training looking at CPR as a model for how you might support someone who reveals thoughts or plans for suicide. CPR stands for current plan, prior behaviour and resources. So the current plan may include preparations that someone has made, including the means, and also making arrangements for after their death. Prior behaviour might include if they've attempted suicide before, but prior behaviour alone is not a sign of a current risk. And the resources, do they have the support now that they had before? What's changed? And prior behaviour and support can go hand in hand. So if prior behaviour, some of the support that was in place at the time, they may find themselves in a difficult position having suicidal thoughts again because maybe that support has ended or it's no longer there, or there may have been a key event, a trigger, a life event that might have impacted their mental health, which might have brought them back to having suicidal thoughts. In terms of a support, personal safety is really important, and calling for assistance. Contact the GP or 999 and also the Samaritans. Help them to create a support plan. Try to discourage substance misuse if possible. Ensure they don't have any ready means or access to take their own life. Encourage a person to talk and listen without judgment and be polite and respectful. In terms of the support plan, look at who can help and who can be brought on to involved to keep them safe. Who can be involved to keep them safe. Suicide is a global pandemic, and suicides are preventable deaths. In terms of self-harm, just to kind of summarise again around some of the facts and intent in supporting someone. It's a behaviour, not an illness. It's self-harm is used as a coping mechanism to feel a release or control, especially if feeling powerless. The person might be experiencing abuse, trauma, bullying, discrimination, low self-esteem and body issues, or other circumstances that they may be using self-harm as a way to cope. Mental health conditions may also coexist, especially ones around depression and anxiety, but they may not have all been diagnosed. Self-harm is not the same thing as an attempted suicide. For many, it can be the means of staying alive. People can accidentally kill themselves. For example, if they're consuming alcohol and drugs, substance misuse, that might mean that when they self-harm, because of the impact that substance misuse can have, interfering with their senses, might mean that somebody might more aggressively self-harm, so may put themselves, their life in danger. Minimization techniques and other coping mechanisms can be explored in terms of supporting somebody. So that might also mean getting treatment for the mental health conditions, looking at ways to minimise the self-harm and how they can be supported to do that. Just a little quiz now, just around true or false. So I'm going to read the questions and give you a few seconds to see if you think you know if the answer is true or if it's false. Approximately, it's estimated at least 1 in 20 of us have suicidal thoughts at any one time. Is that true or false? It's true. The recommended amount of units of alcohol intake in a week is higher for men than women. Is that true or false? It's false. It's 14 for men and women, 0 for pregnant women. It used to be 21 for men, but the effects of alcohol, regardless of our age, our weight, our height, our sex, impact us all in the same way. It's not about tolerance. People from vulnerable and minority groups are less likely to experience or live with poor mental health conditions. True or false? It's false. They are between 1.5 to 2 times more likely to experience or live with poor mental health, and we're going to explore that a little bit later in the session. Self-harm is most common in younger people during teenage years. True or false? It's true, and we'll look a little bit more around that in terms of some of the statistics shortly. Surveys and estimates show around 65% of teens aged 13 to 17 have used or use social media regularly. It's false. It's 90%. And we'll also look at some of the pros and cons around social media and how that might impact a person's mental health and well-being. So let's just take a moment to look at some of the statistics first of all around suicide. According to the World Health Organization, every 40 seconds somebody dies by suicide globally. That's over 800,000 people who die by suicide. The Movember Foundation, which is a charity working to stop men dying too young, one of the areas it focuses on is around mental health and suicide prevention. Statistically, globally, 1 man dies every minute by suicide. Roughly 3 out of every 4 suicides are male. and 1 out of every 4 are female. For every suicide, there are more people who attempt suicide. A prior suicide attempt is the single most important risk factor for suicide in the general population. It's the 4th leading cause of death among 15 to 19-year-olds. Globally, it's the 2nd leading cause of death worldwide in 15 to 29-year-olds. In England, there were 4,921 suicides in 2020. 77% of global suicides occur in low and middle income countries. And ingestion of pesticide, hanging and firearms are among the most common methods of suicide globally. Now, just looking at some of those statistics and kind of looking more broadly at kind of some of the factors that might play into those. In terms of for every 1 suicide, it's estimated that around 15 people are emotionally affected. And when we look at the circumstances surround maybe where somebody's living, for example, the country that they're in, is it a well-developed country, middle income rich, or as we said in the slide there, a low income country? It doesn't necessarily mean the risk that because someone's in a low income country, yes, there is a lot of high risk in terms of less protective factors. So there might be poverty, poor housing, healthcare, crime, homelessness, financial issues, so lack of employment, those kind of things. People in middle income countries and high income countries are not immune. It doesn't necessarily protect. There might be more protective factors, but it might not protect them from the risk of having thoughts or intent around suicide. So, for example, if we think about those in middle and high income countries, there may be circumstances where those people live much high pressured, fast-paced lives. They might have very high-paid, stressful jobs. The pressures to maintain payments upon the mortgage, having a family, going on holidays, regular and more alcohol and possibly drug consumption, potentially more debt as well from that. So there's slightly different risk, the flip side to maybe what there is for lower income countries. In England and Wales in 2020, so on top of that figure there for England, there were an additional couple of hundred, which took the total to 5,222 suicides in England and Wales. The highest group for men and women was 45 to 49. That figure was down on 29 figures, pre-COVID levels. It was down by 467. Talk a little bit and touch on COVID later, but if you remember throughout the first year of the pandemic, there was lots of speculation or concern that lockdown and the pandemic was going to not only have an adverse effect on people's mental health and well-being, which in some cases it has. However, in terms of suicides and the concern that might increase the numbers, hasn't actually been shown in the statistics in terms of those suicides recorded. Having said that, we need to remember that when a suicide occurs in the year, there may be evidence that's not available. So there may be an investigation before it's declared a suicide on the death certificate, and that will be recorded in the year which the death certificate is signed, not necessarily the year in which the death occurred. There may also be other circumstances as to why suicide isn't recorded on the death certificate, and that could be around that maybe the means. So, for example, if they were driving fast, it may go down as a road traffic accident, or it may be down to other issues such as religion and faith. In the last 10 years, the North East of England has had the highest rate of suicides out of all the regions in England. And we're going to talk a little bit more about substance misuse and how that might play a factor in terms of suicide and the risk. Self-harm statistics now. Self-harm is more common in women, and around 16.7% of females will self-harm at some point in their lives, compared to a figure of 4.8% of men. There have been past increases in the number of women who have attended hospital following self-harm associated with alcohol and drug misuse, and self-harm can be more likely to do after consuming alcohol. 1 in 50 patients who attended hospital after self-harm will die by suicide within 1 year, and 15 within 9 years. In 2018-19, it's estimated 24% of 17-year-olds had reported self-harm in the previous year, and nearly half of 17 to 19-year-olds with a diagnosable mental health condition of self-harm or attempted suicide at some point, rising up to 53% for young women. The Royal College of Psychiatrists believe that every person who self-harms and or has suicidal thoughts should have a safety plan in place. The key things that it's recommended this should be focused on is what the person's reasons for livings are, so ideas for getting through tough times, difficult situations, ways that they might be able to make a situation safer, things to calm and lift the mood, distractions and sources of support, so who does that person trust? As it says on the slide there, the age group of 17 to 19, this is the age group where self-harm is most prevalent. Self-harm in young people tends to focus on methods around overdose, cutting, burning, scalding, and banging body parts against the wall. For adults, majority of those are self-poisoning or overdose. Other methods cut across age groups in terms of cutting, refusing to eat, hitting self, biting, and carbon monoxide poisoning. So in terms of suicide and self-harm prevention, so some of those statistics are quite shocking. And as I mentioned earlier, suicide in itself is a global pandemic that we can and should be doing more about to support people. The government plans for suicide prevention exist at a local and national level, and nearly every local area in England now has a suicide prevention plan in place. In terms of some of the key areas that Samaritans have found in support of as part of their research is reducing risks in men, was included in 97% of local authority plans, 70% delivering action. Bereavement support was included in 97% of plans, with 71% delivering. Children and young people are included in 92% of plans, with 80% delivering. And preventing self-harm is included in 92%, but with only 55% delivering action, which is maybe more concerning that one is actually quite low. Through the research and the campaigning from the Samaritans, they've set ambitious targets to try and help reduce suicide, especially among vulnerable groups, which, as I said, we'll talk about in a little while. Those things should also include prioritising action on suicide prevention, that includes across government departments, provide ambitious leadership resources and guidance locally, and to set out ring-fence funding for suicide prevention to evidence-based interventions that support the most vulnerable people. In terms of the statistics that we looked at a moment ago and the plans that have been set up by the government, a government research report that was published in 2012 set out some of the key aims to reduce the suicide rates in the general population and to better support those bereaved or affected by suicide. That report was updated in 2017 to include tackling self-harm. The updated strategy including a commitment to reduce suicides from 2015 levels, which was 5,199 in England, by 10% by the year 2020-21, However, as we've seen from the previous slide, there were 4,921 suicides in England in the year 2020, which isn't quite 10%. In fact, it's nearer a 5% drop. So there's obviously still more work that needs to be done. Keeping an individual safe might include things encouraging them to talk, seek professional help, time out from social media, and we'll talk about why that's maybe something to explore in a little while. Think about 3 things to be grateful for each day, be kind to themselves and keep a journal. And this might also be something that you do for your own self-care, which we'll touch on at the end of the session. Young Minds provide some really good guidance and tips to keep yourself safe and reduce the risk of self-injury, although recognising you might not be able to stop straight away. Those tips might include doing things like going for a walk, gentle exercises, focusing on breathing, texting a friend and asking for help to take your mind off things, someone to talk to. Play music, sing, dance, hold an ice cube, write your thoughts down, hit a cushion or a pillow, tear up a magazine, or make a self-soothing box. That might include sensory objects, something to smell, touch, taste, and look at. So that might include things like to touch a stress ball, which can help relax muscles, photos of happy occasions, smells like peppermint and lavender, essential oil or spray, scented candles, music, water. Sipping can be good to help keep a steady rhythm of breathing, and maybe even a quote card with positive sayings and phrases from films and books. And another one to recommend might be adult colouring in too. Let's now look at some of the risks to vulnerable groups. Homelessness, LGBTQ+ community and ethnic minorities. Over 80% of homeless are men, but why are they homeless? And around 1 in 15 of LGBTQ+ are homeless. LGBTQ+ men are more at risk of self-harm and suicidal behaviours, and teenagers self-injure at a much higher rate than their heterosexual peers. A recent study showed 38 to 53% of individuals in this population engaged in those behaviours. Unfortunately, the LGBTQ+ population experiences high rates of emotional isolation, fears of safety, overarching stigmatisation, and all of these factors can impact somebody's mental health. Additionally, many people struggle to cope with these difficult realities and then may hurt themselves as a result. Gay and bi men are also 4 times more likely to die by suicide in their life, and more than half of young people experience abuse and discrimination in schools. In terms of homelessness and the links to LGBTQ+, 24% of homeless youths are subject to rejection, violence, or abuse as a result of gender identity, and 1 in 8 LGBTQ+ receive unfair treatment or have reported unfair treatment from healthcare, and 1 in 7 people avoid it, seeking help due to discrimination. It might also include them being outed, and in a Stonewall study around LGBTQ+ mental health in 2018, there was a number of reports and case studies where people had reported being discriminated or outed because of their sexuality, or even to the point of being told that they were having suicidal thoughts because of the lifestyle choice that they were making. So all of these things can obviously create a barrier to why somebody might not get help, a fear of not getting the right help and support. In terms of the workplace, around 35% of LGBTQ+ hide who they are from work due to fear of discrimination, and 2/3 of the community have experienced anti-LGBTQ+ violence or abuse. However, only 1 in 8 report that to the police. 1/3 of our ethnic minority, LGBTQ+, experience hate crime when it's compared to LGBTQ plus white members of the community. And 2 out of 5 trans experience hate crime due to gender identity. In terms of the education setting, it's estimated around 42% of LGBTQ plus pupils in the last year have been bullied, which is double that figure from non-LGBTQ plus. Half of those pupils in the community hear homophobic slurs, and if we think more broadly around what's happening around the world, currently there's 70 countries that criminalise same-sex relationship, and around a quarter of the world's countries' populations believe that LGBTQ plus should be a crime. It was only up until as recent as 1990 that the World Health Organization removed being gay as a mental health condition. If we think a little bit about COVID and the impacts that might have had and additional adverse effects that it might have had for the vulnerable groups, obviously everyone was exposed and impacted by COVID, especially around bereavement, isolation, potentially loss of income. They may have already had existing mental health conditions that we're living with. It might have increased alcohol and drug use and insomnia, as well as anxiety. And obviously COVID itself can lead to health complications. People with pre-existing conditions may have struggled and been impacted more, especially with anxiety. And a survey that was recently conducted by Mind found that half of people were worried about the transition to being near and seeing others, and young people especially found it hard to cope. They were more likely to self-harm than adults, and isolation and loneliness made mental health worse. For people coming out as members of the LGBTQ plus community, that can be quite exciting and liberating, but might also bring potential risks and difficulties along with that, not just surrounding the circumstances in terms of when they first come out. So will they be accepted? Maybe they'll be judged, discriminated against, levels of anxiety, stress. But it's not a one-off event, and something that many people in the community experience many times over. For example, when you start education, when you start a new job, when you meet new friends, when you go on holiday, those might be occasions where you're repeatedly having to come out and share your sexuality with people, again not knowing maybe how you're going to be accepted. If you experience rejection, abuse or discrimination at any of those points of when you've come out, especially early on, then it might stop you coming out again. It might force you to hide who you are, and that might lead to stress or mental health conditions. Older LGBTQ plus members face discrimination due to laws and age and society, and potentially have less role models in society. In terms of a coping mechanism as well, LGBTQ plus are more likely to use drugs than heterosexual people. It's 3 times higher than straight men, and heavy drinking may lead to a mental health condition or making pre-existing ones worse. We'll talk a bit more about substance misuse shortly. Many LGBTQ plus worry about how they look and are perceived. Many LGBTQ plus worry about how they look for fear of discrimination, and those living with HIV, the medication can affect emotional well-being, anxiety and depression, and stigma, and some cannot be taken with mental health medication. Nearly 1 in 5 of us come from an ethnic minority background, so experiences challenges such as racism, stigma, and inequalities, which can affect the individual's mental health and well-being. Rates of mental health conditions or illnesses can be higher for some of those in the ethnic minority communities, especially when compared to groups of white people. For example, black men are more likely to have experienced psychotic disorder in the last year than white men. Black people are 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act than white people. Older South Asian women are at an at-risk group for suicide, and refugees and asylum seekers are more likely to experience poor mental health than the general population, which might include higher rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD too. Racism can range from microaggressions, so subtle but offensive comments, behaviours, to explicit hurtful words, to verbal or physical aggression. Experiencing racism can be very stressful, have a negative effect on your overall health and well-being, and being exposed to racism is likely to increase the risk of you developing or living with mental health conditions such as depression. If we think about social and economic inequalities, people from ethnic minority communities often face disadvantages in society too. They're more likely to experience poverty and homelessness, do less well at school, be unemployed, be in contact with someone in the criminal justice system, face challenges when accessing services, and each of those can increase the risk of developing poor mental health. Let's look at substance misuse now. Recommended weekly units we touched on earlier as part of the quiz. It's 14 for men, 14 for women, 0 for pregnant women. The effects of alcohol can obviously lower our inhibitions, might make us feel we can take more risks, and in terms of self-harm and suicide, potentially will put us at more risk. For example, for those that might self-harm, if they're consuming it under the influence of alcohol and drugs, it might mean that they more aggressively self-harm to be able to feel for that release. Alcohol is quite commonly drunk by men before a suicide attempt. And we all know alcohol is also a depressant and can interfere with all medication. Potential risks of substance misuse for those who self-harm or display suicidal behaviours. So as we've mentioned there, there's particular risks that could be. So as we just said there, potential risks of substance misuse for those who self-harm or display suicide behaviours. So reflecting back on one of the things we talked about earlier on in the start, looking at maybe ways to minimise alcohol and drug consumption, the effect on medication that it can have, dual diagnosis, which I'll come on to in a moment, and those with alcohol drug addiction, how best should they be supported? So dual diagnosis might exist where someone has an alcohol or drug addiction, is very reliant on alcohol and drugs, and they're a very vulnerable group in terms of receiving the appropriate care that they need. Somebody would need to be clean or sober long enough to be able to access services where they can be diagnosed and supported with therapy, again for the medication, as we've said, to take effect, and understanding, was it an underlying mental health condition that led to them using unhelpful and unhealthy coping mechanisms to cope with poor mental health? Or was it through alcohol and drugs that has led to them developing poor mental health? So in terms of accessing services and getting the right support and diagnosis, they would obviously have to be managing their intake, drinking less than 14 units a week, being clean to get the right help and support. So encouraging them to explore ways around self-care and coping mechanisms to reduce that amount of alcohol intake. Let's take a moment to look at potential effects that prisons or being in prison may have on someone in terms of the risks around self-harm and suicide. So in terms of, first of all, what backgrounds and experiences lead to vulnerability before entering a prison may include past self-harm or suicide attempts, poor mental health conditions, deprivation, or a traumatic life event. And experiences in prison that may increase vulnerability could be around prison regime and the conditions, social and physical isolation, uncertainty around sentence and parole, exposure to suicide and self-harm within the prison environment, and adjustment to the environment overall. 2018 to 2020 report found that prison mental health support for men was inadequate in around half of prisons. Reports recommended that mental health screening should take place on arrival for all prisoners, but what it found was that those from ethnic minority backgrounds were less likely to be screened or offered support. One of the main disturbing effects of restrictions within prison was the overall emotional, psychological and physical well-being. A recent report that was published on the 21st of September 2021 looked at prisons between the period of 2018 and 2020 and found that support for men was inadequate around half of our prisons. It recommended that mental health screening should be taking place on arrival. That wasn't always happening and was less likely that screening or support will be offered to those from ethnic minorities. One of the most disturbing effects of the restrictions was a decline in the prisoners' emotional, physical and psychological well-being, and an overall sense of hopelessness and helplessness that became ingrained, which was the cumulative effect of such prolonged and severe restrictions on prisoners' mental health and well-being being profound. Women prisoners have been particularly affected by a lack of contact with support by fellow prisoners and not seeing their families. Male prisoners reported some decrease in anxiety at the beginning when we look at how lockdown affected the prisons, because it reduced issues such as bullying and the sense of the restrictions being necessary for their own protection that COVID and lockdown actually brought. However, prisons across male, female, children and young people's estates report feeling worse as time has gone on. Prisons are quite often looked at as a place of safety. So under the Mental Health Act 1983, some people who are acutely mentally ill are sent to prison, as there may not be anywhere else safe for them to be. Prisons are used as an emergency place of safety under the Mental Health Act, simply because there's no mental health bed available for them in the community. People can be kept in a place of safety under the Mental Health Act for up to 36 hours if there's medical advice to support it. And that's come from a Samaritans report. People in prisons are more significantly likely to die by suicide than people in the general population. In 2018, there were 92 self-inflicted deaths in prisons across England and Wales. In prison, the suicide risk is a combination of life experience before imprisonment, as we said on the slide there, and the pains of prison life and adjusting to prison life, as well as what somebody might be exposed to. Recent research showed that some of the key factors, especially mental ill health, past self-harm, traumatic life event experiences, and a background of disadvantage are disproportionately common among prisoners, putting them at higher risk of suicide before they've even entered prison. Prison environments such as social and physical isolation, uncertainty around sentencing, inconsistent regime, and a greater likelihood of exposure to fellow inmates who use self-harm and suicide can make the risk worse. So people in prison are at increased risk of suicide than the general population, and that's reflected not just across England, Wales and the UK, but globally. Overall, poor mental health is exceptionally common, unfortunately, in prisons. 45% of adults in prison have anxiety or depression diagnosed. 8% have a diagnosis of psychosis, and 60% have experienced traumatic brain injury. So some of the things we're going to look at in terms of what the impacts of social media might be in terms of the risks around self-harm and suicide, around what's the positives of social media, what the negatives, what is FOMO, and what conditions could it be linked to, any key risks, especially young people might face, and what role social media plays in self-harm and suicide risk, and what could or do schools do to support young people. Social media does have many positives. There's a lot of useful information that's accessible out there. It's also a tool for learning and connecting with people or progressing your career, looking for job opportunities. When we create a social media profile or we go on social media, we might be looking for endorsement, admiration, likes, followers. The negatives of social media might be that we don't get that. It might be that we don't get the likes. We might not have many people connecting with us. There may also then be a risk that people might say unpleasant things to us online. That might lead to being bullied or trolled online and having abusive and hurtful things said to us that might impact on our mental health. Over 3 billion people around the globe are active monthly users of social media, which shows just how much social media has become an integral and large part and to some extent unavoidable part of our lives, especially if you think about through education and work. We rely so heavily on social media, emails and using different platforms for learning. Fear of missing out, which is what FOMO means, could be linked to conditions around anxiety. So to start off with, social media addiction has been referred to in a wide variety of studies and experiments around how social media might impact our mental health and well-being. It's thought that the addiction to social media affects around 5% of young people, and it's recently been described as potentially more addictive than alcohol and cigarettes. Its addictive nature is owed to the degree of compulsivity in which the urge to check your social media may be linked to that instant gratification, so the need to experience fast, short-term pleasure, and the dopamine production, which is the chemical in the brain associated with reward and pleasure. The desire for that hit of dopamine, coupled with the failure to gain instant gratification, may then prompt users to perpetually refresh their social media feeds. What's dangerous about the compulsive use is that as gratification is not experienced, users may internalize beliefs about being unpopular, unfunny, lack of likes on a status update. That might have a negative effect on self-reflection, prompting continual refreshing of the page, hoping to see another person has enjoyed the post, thus helping us to feel that we've achieved personal validation. And although these perceptions may not actually reflect one's image in the eyes of others, the absence of gratification may amplify feelings of anxiety or loneliness. So when we experience FOMO or fear of missing out, that might lead to development of mental health conditions which are aligned to experiencing anxiety disorders and loneliness and lower mood. A recent study conducted by the OECD found that those who use social media more intensively on average had lower life satisfaction. Associated with the desire for instant gratification is the negative impact that those platforms can also have on sleep and sleep quality. Data studies have shown that using social media compulsively can damage our sleep patterns, which have an adverse effect on our learning, especially on young people's performance in school. In terms of what role social media could play in self-harm and suicide, linked to some of the negative sides of suicide, there is unfortunately information out there which people might be able to access or they might be invited into in terms of self-harming and pro-suicide internet sites and chat rooms. In terms of what schools are doing, many schools do have social media policies and are helping support pupils to be safe online in terms of reporting anything which might encourage or actively promote self-harm or suicide, and also making sure that they stay safe when they're online. So if there is any bullying or trolling that takes place online, things like that should be called out, should be reported, and pupils and people generally shouldn't be contributing to that. Recent research by Mind has showed that loneliness has hit young people's mental health the hardest. Nearly 9 in 10, 88% said it made their mental health worse. So if we couple that with COVID, pandemic, lockdown, and maybe the need to access social media, then that has had a profound effect on their overall mental health and well-being. In terms of lockdown more specifically and feeling isolated, young people are more affected by the lack of private space in their home, around 56%, as opposed to adults, 36%. And also within that report, 73% of young people said that they spend too much time on social media. So recognising maybe that it's not also having a positive effect on their overall well-being. So we've come to the end of the session now. As it says, it's important to look after your own self-care and build and maintain positive mental health and well-being. So some of those things may include some of the things that we've already mentioned around talking to someone, asking for help and support, putting yourself first, taking time out, being able and feeling empowered to say no, doing things that you enjoy, forgiving yourself, so be kind to yourself, don't put yourself under that too much pressure. Write 3 things down at the start of every day to be grateful for. Keep a mood journal. Get out in nature. Physical exercise can help and has been proven to be as effective as medication to treat mild to moderate depression, although obviously you might not be able to start exercising as early as you had a medication. Physical exercise can help and has been proven to be as effective as medication to treat mild to moderate depression. Obviously, you may not be able to start exercising or doing much early on upon diagnosis and getting medication, but over a period of time that can help. And yoga, meditation and mindfulness are also very useful. So explore what works for you for your self-care and help others in supporting and accessing different things that might work for them too. There's a list of useful sources of information there. Samaritan's Mind, Papyrus, the Government Commons Library, Mental Health First England, Shout and Young Minds, that has some of the information around what's been shared on the session today. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found that useful.